Now, the idea of not touching a nidah because of tumah, because of ritual impurity, is actually null and void today, mainly because we don't have a temple anymore, or the ashes of the red heifer used to purify a tamei met, someone who has an impurity that one acquires through contact with the dead body, and also something that everyone today is in some way expected to have. Also, we don't need truma or deal with kochim anymore, which is exactly what the Rambam states in Hilchot Tumat Ochlin. So the next time you hear that you can't touch a woman on the basis that she's tamei or impure, remember that that's not the reason, my friends. And friends, this is really an area that really has to be cleared up. That's that becoming tamei or ceremonially or ritually unclean is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. In other words, by becoming ceremonially or remaining ceremonially unclean, which, like I said, is a state that virtually everyone is in today, is really nothing that should keep you up at night. In other words, it's not necessarily tied to sin in any way, nor is anyone sinning by becoming or remaining unclean. For example, women become tamei monthly and during childbirth, right? The Kohanim who prepared the ashes of the paraduma also became tamei, or someone could even become tamei for the sake of a mitzvah, right? Like preparing a body for burial. Now, this was the reality even in the times of Chazal, right? The Mishnah even states that someone who volunteered to keep the prohibitions pertaining to Tumah and Tahara all year round was called a Porush, meaning a separated person, someone who separated himself from Tumah and from impurity, when he practically really didn't have to. And friends, these are not to be confused with the Perushim, not to say that many Perushim or Pharisees didn't join their ranks. And really, it makes you think what's fueling this whole mikvah craze for men nowadays, especially Hasidim who go to the mikvah every day. But anyways, another reason it's strange is because there's actually no part in Torah that requires a Jew to remain clean all year round, with the exception of during the 3 major Chagim, where visiting the temple was an actual mitzvah and thus mandatory. But regardless, you're probably wondering, then why do we need to avoid touching any nidah if the notion of actual ritual purity is not a concern in our day and age? Well, friends, the short answer is that although the notion of ritual purity is not important in Torah and Halakha, Torah still specifically prohibits sexual relations with a nidah, with a woman during her period. So in other words, the whole prohibition is only to avoid an isur biyah, a forbidden relationship to occur. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, Rabbi Asher, we have constantly heard from those who adhere to being Shomer Negiah that the reason we're not allowed to touch between males and females is because of Tumat Nidah, because of the impurity imparted from a Nidah. Now, to give the Shomer Negiah crowd some credit, most people who say that they're Shomer Negiah really do not know why they're not touching the opposite sex, and really just boil it down to stating that it's not modest to do so. And will then just say Tumat Nidah because they know that it must be affiliated with that notion to some extent. And it is. In other words, the real reason the Shomer Negiah crowd abstains from touching the opposite sex is because every woman is supposedly considered to be in a Nidah state. And there is a prohibition in sleeping with a Nidah. And of course, friends, as you know, shaking hands leads to sex. No, not at all, friends. Actually, the prohibition of not touching at all does not appear in any Talmudic source and was only later proposed as a chumrah, as a stringency by the minority of medieval rabbis, and because it made its way into the Shulchan Aruch, it became the norm. However, if you're like us who understands that all halakha has to have its basis within the pages of Talmudic literature, this custom of being Shomer Negiah gets shot down. So friends, there's really no halachic reason to justify the Shomer Negiah phenomenon we see occurring today. Not to in any way justify kissing and hugging between unmarried couples, but the ridiculous extreme that has been taken and is being practiced is really baseless. Actually, the Gemara lists many examples of the rabbis hugging and kissing arayot. Mind you, the contact is not intimate or sensual or sexual in nature, right? But it's enough to show you that there is no clear prohibition against contact in general. In other words, it is true that we are forbidding from contact with an erva, which in our case would be any woman with her period. And it's also true that every woman is pretty much considered to be having her period, mainly because we're not going to ask them if they are. However, what we must not fail to mention is that the prohibition of contact with an erva is only the contact of a sensual, seductive nature that, again, will lead to intercourse and not just any touching. Now, unfortunately, this whole issue of being Shomer Nagia and people saying that this is the actual standard given on Har Sinai, in my opinion, is just one more thing to keep religious Jews from returning to Judaism or people from converting into Judaism, is really not confronted by modern day rabbis. And I really cannot think of many things that Orthodox rabbis today confront at all, which should really speak about the lack of courage that exists in the Orthodox world today. Really, the more religious they claim to be usually goes hand in hand with the amount of courage they lack.